Well, let me welcome you very warmly indeed this evening to Christchurch. It's great to have you with us. I'm conscious there are people here this evening from the local community, the local schools and colleges, local churches across West London. Wherever you're from this evening, you're very warmly welcome indeed with us. We put on events like this from time to time to give the church family, but also members of the local community, an opportunity to ask the big questions, to consider the questions that are out there in the world. And we're always delighted when we've got a speaker who can help us think through those questions more closely and more carefully. This evening, we're delighted to welcome Professor John Lennox as our guest speaker. John was born in Northern Ireland, is the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford, as well as a Fellow of Wycliffe Hall and the Side Business School in Oxford. After school in Armagh in Northern Ireland, John became the Exhibitioner and Senior Scholar at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, and went on to obtain an MA and a PhD from the University in Cambridge, before being awarded a DSc in Cardiff for his research and a DPhil from the University of Oxford. He's got a few more degrees than I've managed to pick up in my time, and I suspect he'd beat me at a game of mental arithmetic. During his 29 years at the University of Wales in Cardiff, John was the Alexander Humboldt Fellow at the University of Freiburg for a year and has lectured extensively in the former Soviet Union, in Russia, in Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe and North America, in the areas of mathematics, apologetics, and philosophy. John is the author of many, many books, some of which are available at the back afterwards if you're intrigued or interested in pursuing the subject further. Some of which are available afterwards. He's also presented on Radio 4 and debated against many of the so-called new atheists, including Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, and Peter Singer. I'm sure you'll agree that we've got somebody speaking to us this evening who is more than qualified to address the title of, is it reasonable to believe in God in a scientific world? John will speak for 25 to 30 minutes. Please feel free in that time to pick up these white bits of paper and scribble down your questions. John is very happy to answer questions afterwards, and let me encourage you to be engaged as you're listening and writing down your questions as we go. There'll then be a brief break after he finishes speaking, 5 minutes or so. You can top up your glasses, you can take a comfort break or whatever you need to do, and while we sort the questions, and then we'll grill John with the questions until 9 o'clock, when we hope to draw stumps and mop up any spilt wine and that sort of thing. So you're very warmly welcome. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Lennox.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming on this freezing cold evening. And I hope that you might find something this evening that will warm at least part of your grey cells. The title this evening is interesting. Is it reasonable to believe in God in a scientific world? What would we mean by a scientific world? I notice the title isn't, is it reasonable to believe in God in a musical world, or an artistic world, or a literary world? Because after all of those disciplines form part of our human experience. So why concentrate on science? Well, there are several reasons for that. One is the widespread idea that in the last analysis, science is the only way to truth, or the only serious way to truth. That has been popularized by people like Richard Dawkins and perhaps more particularly by Stephen Hawking. It is false, as a very simple piece of thought will indicate, because if science is the only way to truth, then you'd have to close half the faculties in every university in this country. There'd be no literature. There'd be no languages, there'd be no history, there'd be no economics. And unfortunately, such is the cultural authority of science, not without justification, that there has developed a hubris into thinking that science is the only way to truth. I've been fascinated by logic since I was a small boy, and when I hear statements like science is the only way to truth, I subject them to logical analysis. Because you see, the statement science is the only way to truth is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. So perhaps it's too late in the evening for logic, but let's try anyway. It means that it's logically incoherent. And Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize, an amazing scientist, said, "We do science a disservice if we think that it can answer every question." It obviously can't. It can't even answer the simple questions of a child. Where do I come from? Where am I going to? What is the meaning of my life? We have to look outside science, to literature and philosophy and theology for answers to those questions. So my first point is, it's not a scientific world. Science is one intellectual discipline that has very successfully revealed to us part of the nature of nature. But thank God, not all. And I, for one, am grateful for history and literature and languages and music and art and all those other ways of exploring the wonder of human experience. Surely you can't be a scientist and believe in God these days. Why not? Well, science has given us such marvelous explanations of the universe and shown us that God just isn't necessary. Belief in God is old-fashioned. It belongs to the days when people didn't really understand the universe and just took the lazy way out and said, God did it. That won't do anymore. In fact, the sooner we get rid of religion, the better. Well, that's the popular story, and it's supported by some very powerful people. For instance, Steven Weinberg, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics, says, the world needs to wake from the long nightmare of religion. Anything we scientists can do to weaken the hold of religion should be done, and may in fact be our greatest contribution to civilization. We might just notice the rather sinister totalitarian element. Anything that we can do ought to be done. That attitude isn't new. I met it 50 years ago while studying at Cambridge. On one occasion, the only occasion, I found myself at dinner sitting beside a Nobel Prize winner. Not Weinberg, somebody else. Never met anybody of that eminence before, and wondered, what can I talk about? What questions can I ask? So I decided to gain as much as possible from this encounter by asking him questions about how science shaped his worldview, the answers that he had formed to the big questions of life. And in particular, I was interested in whether his wide-ranging studies and his success had led him to make any reflections on the existence of God. The mention of the word God was a trigger for discomfort. And since I don't like people to be uncomfortable around me, I backed off and changed the subject and thought that was the end of it. But at the end of the meal, he invited me to come to his study, invited 2 or 3 other senior academics, and so far as I recall, he asked me to sit and they stood around me. Lennox, do you want a career in science? Yes, sir. Then he said, in front of witnesses tonight, you should give up this childish faith in God. If you don't, it will cripple you intellectually. You will suffer in comparison with your peers. You will not make it. Talk about pressure. Here was I, an undergraduate, and this was a Nobel Prize winner attempting to use his cultural power to squeeze the Christian life out of me. I was a bit paralyzed, but in the end I said, sir, what have you got to offer me that's better than what I already have? And he came out with some ancient philosophy that, thanks to my reading of C.S. Lewis, I knew a bit about. And I just stopped him. I said, if that's all you've got, then I'll take the risk. Thank you and good night. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that put steel into my mind and heart. I thought, suppose it had been the other way around, and I'd been an atheist, and he'd been a Nobel Prize winning Christian, and they'd stood around me and tried to beat Christianity into me. It would have hit the newspaper headlines throughout Britain the very next day, and there would have been disciplinary proceedings in the university. It was threat, it was bullying. And I remember deciding that day, if ever I get a chance to be a scientist, I would love to be in a position to go out in front of the public and encourage them to think about these big questions without threatening and without bullying and without trying to use my cultural authority to do so. The sad thing is, he was totally wrong. And he should have known he was wrong. Because if you look up the Nobel Prize winners between 1900 and 2000, over 60% of them believed in God. So the idea that science and faith in God are incompatible is demonstrably false. But it's important to see just what that means. For instance, still alive today, there are 2 Nobel Prize winners in physics. Peter Higgs is one of them in Scotland, an atheist, and Bill Phillips, a Christian in America. Now just think of those 2 men. What divides them? Not their science. They both won the Nobel Prize. What divides them is their worldview. And what that shows me is this, that the idea that science and faith in God is incompatible is just false. Here's a Nobel Prize winner believing in God. Here's another who's an atheist. Where the real conflict lies in our society, we're told it's a conflict between science and God. It isn't. It's a conflict between 2 worldviews. The worldview of science, the worldview of naturalism or materialism on the one side, and the worldview of theism, Christian theism in my case, on the other side. That's where the conflict is. But what is happening is that the public is told it's science versus God. So if you want to be intellectually respectable, you'll go with science and reject God. That is demonstrably false. And it saddens me how many people buy into it. So the question that needs to be asked, the much more serious question, is this: can science help us at all? Does it point towards God? Does it point against God? Or is it neutral? And I spent a large part of my life thinking about that. So we're doing worldview thinking tonight. Naturalism is the idea that the universe or multiverse or whatever you call it is all that exists. Mass energy is the fundamental stuff. There's nothing else. There is no transcendence. Sean Carroll, the physicist, wrote a bestseller recently called The Big Picture. And he said, we humans are blobs of organized mud, which through the impersonal workings of nature's patterns have developed the capacity to contemplate and cherish and engage with the intimidating complexity of the world around us. The meaning we find in life is not transcendent. Now notice, that is a statement by a scientist. And here comes the next mistake. All statements by scientists are statements of science. They are not. This is simply a statement of his personal belief. It's not a statement of science. But unfortunately, because he's a physicist, people read the book and they invest it with the authority of an established result of science, like Newton's second law. We need to learn, ladies and gentlemen, that not everything scientists say is science. In fact, Richard Feynman, whom I love to read, brilliant Nobel Prize winner, he says outside of his field, the scientist is just as dumb as the next chap. And that's worth remembering. So we'll do a little bit of looking at some of the evidence very briefly. Now, I have a website called johnlennox.org. And you can see me there in various situations of debate and lecturing in many of the world's leading universities. So if you want to follow it up, then you can do that. I said scientists can be as dumb as the next chap. In fact, they can get it wrong. For example, Stephen Hawking, in his book, The Grand Design, says this: philosophy is dead, and it's now left to scientists to bear the torch of truth in our generation. Philosophy is dead, but he caused a lot of upset in the philosophy department in Cambridge when he wrote that. But he also caused a huge amount of laughter, because he says at the beginning of his book, philosophy is dead, and what's the book about? The philosophy of science. And I'm afraid, if I dare say so, he proves adequately that as far as he's concerned, philosophy is dead. It's tragic. Here's a brilliant, world-class scientist. I remember him at Cambridge. He was just ahead of me. But he's light years ahead of me as a scientist. But once he goes outside science, you find these wild statements. And the public needs to be aware of this kind of thing that is happening in the name of science. The second example of getting it wrong is Richard Dawkins' claim that God is a delusion. You've all heard of the book and maybe even read it, The God Delusion. And when I first read it, I thought that's interesting because delusion is a concept from psychiatry. It means, to use Dawkins' definition, which is quite good, a persistent false belief held in the face of strong, contradictory evidence. And I thought this is very interesting. Let's see what Dawkins says about the research in psychiatry he's read, because obviously he's not a psychiatrist and nor am I. So what do? Well, what I do is to say, what do the experts in the field say? And to my astonishment, when I started to read the experts in the field, I found they contradicted Dawkins completely. That he's simply wrong. Now let me give you an example of that. Let's go to the top of the field of psychiatry. The president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, past president, Andrew Sims. Here's what he says. The advantageous effect of religious belief and spirituality is one of the best kept secrets in psychiatry and medicine generally. If the findings of the huge volume of research on this topic had gone in the opposite direction, and it had been found that religion damages your mental health, it would have been front page news in every newspaper in the land. And Sims tells us, furthermore, that in a major survey conducted for the American Journal of Public Health, the majority of studies correlated religious involvement with well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, hope, optimism, purpose and meaning, higher self-esteem, better adaptation to bereavement, greater social support, less loneliness, lower rates of depression, and faster rates of recovery, etc., etc., etc. And where do we read of that in Dawkins? Nowhere. In other words, ladies and gentlemen, he's claiming to give you scientific evidence from the field of psychiatry, which is not his own field. That's okay. But he's not giving you the evidence of the experts in the field. So it's the Dawkins delusion. He's deluding you with non-facts. And I regard that as a very serious thing to do. Claiming to use science to make your point, but not doing the research. Now, we know that the man most associated with the idea that God is a delusion is Sigmund Freud. And one of Germany's best-selling psychiatrists, a very interesting man called Manfred Lutz, points out that the Freudian explanation of religion as wish fulfillment works very well, provided only God does not exist. But then he points out, you see, that if God does exist, the very same argument will show you that atheism is a delusion. The desire never to have to meet God and give account for the mess you've made of your life and other people's lives. You see, the flip side of Freudianism, we never hear. But you will hear it from people, some of them who have lived in the Marxist world, where I've spent a lot of time during the Cold War. Take Czesław Miłosz, who won the Nobel Prize for Literature in Poland. He says, a true opium of the people is a belief in nothingness after death. the huge solace of thinking that for our betrayals, greed, cowardice, murders, we are not going to be judged. So for him, atheism is a psychological escape mechanism to avoid the concept of having to face judgment for what you've done wrong. Manfred Lutz points out, you see, it's interesting. If God doesn't exist, Freud explains religion brilliantly. If God does exist, Freud explains atheism brilliantly. But what Freud doesn't do, he can't help you to decide whether God exists or not. And that's a very sharp and penetrating remark. I can't help telling you this, forgive me, but Stephen Hawking was asked what he thought of religion and gave the typical Freudian answer. Religion is a fairy story for people afraid of the dark. I was asked to comment in the Daily Mail or something, I can't remember what it was, but I know it reached John Humphreys on the news at 8 o'clock in the morning. I was asked to comment and I said, do you want a one-liner? Oh yes, they said, please give us a one-liner. So I did. I said, atheism is a fairy story for people afraid of the light. Now, you laugh, you see, because you haven't understood what I was saying 2 minutes ago. Those two statements are statements of our personal belief. Hawking's statement was a statement of his belief. It's got nothing to do with science. My statement is a statement of my personal belief. It's nothing to do with science. The statements themselves do not decide which of them is true. But we have to decide that. So we proceed a little bit. The other thing is, an example of scientists getting it very foolishly wrong is the jibe that I meet around Christmas time when I'm doing debates. And a scientist will stand up and say, Lennox, your God is like Santa Claus. Have you heard this? Like the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus, you see. And I remember once being in front of a very large audience in a very famous Dutch university. There's several thousand people there. And I just stopped the man who said that. I said, let's test your hypothesis. And he looked at me as if to say, how are you going to test it? I said, very easily. So I asked the audience, tell me, how many of you came to believe in Santa Claus as adults? And not a hand went up. And then I said, how many of you came to believe in God as adults? And hundreds of hands went up. And then I turned back to him and said, please don't insult our intelligence. For centuries, some of the finest minds in the world have been thinking about God and the arguments about his existence, the authenticity of the Bible, etc. They haven't been doing that about Santa Claus. You see, these are silly arguments, ladies and gentlemen. But what frightens me almost is I meet them again and again from intelligent students and professors who think that deals with the God question. Doesn't even begin to deal with the God question. So let's go on to the positive side. And the background to this, and it's going to be very brief, is the very odd fact that you've two Lucasian professors, Isaac Newton and Stephen Hawking, same chair at Cambridge, hundreds of years apart. Isaac Newton discovered the law of gravity, and Isaac Newton was a believer in God. Stephen Hawking studies the law of gravity, and he's an atheist. What is more, he uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. And that puzzles the Irish in me. You know, that got me really interested. I need to investigate this. How can you possibly get there? And I think I understand what has happened, and it may interest you. First point is this. As evidence that science points towards God, we need look no further than beyond the history of modern science. Because you see, all the pioneers of modern science, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, Babbage, they were all believers in God. So much so that there's a thesis about this called Merton's thesis, which C.S. Lewis put this way. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature. And they expected law in nature. Why? Because they believed in a lawgiver. Faith in God didn't hinder the rise of science. It was actually the motor that drove it. And sometimes I put this very provocatively. I am not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian, because arguably it was Christianity that gave me my subject. So here's the amazing thing. Newton discovers gravity, and he doesn't write a book, his most famous book, Principia Mathematica, saying, now I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. No, he says, what a brilliant God that did it that way. And you know, when you think about it, that's the way our mind works, isn't it? The more you understand about engineering, the more you admire the genius of a Rolls-Royce, not the less. The more you understand about art, the more you admire the genius of a Rembrandt or a Picasso, not the less. And the more Newton understood of the way the universe worked, the more he admired the genius of the God that did it that way. So what's gone wrong? How can Hawking tell young people quite explicitly, you've got to choose between science and God? Well, let's have a little look at it. The first reason, which I'll deal with briefly, is because he's got the wrong concept of God, I'm afraid. He's thinking not of the God of the Bible, who is eternal and the creator of everything. He's thinking of a Greek God, like the God of lightning, who's simply postulated to account for a phenomenon we don't understand. Science gets rid of those gods. Imperial College down the road will get rid of them in lecture 1. And good riddance, you see. But the God of the Bible is not a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. I hope you've all read the first page of the Bible. It's very good reading, you know. It starts like this. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Oh, it doesn't, does it? But that's exactly what Hawking thinks. That I believe in a God who's just there until we have a scientific explanation. Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, your logic will tell you, if you believe in a God like that, you'll have to choose between God and science. That's because you define God that way. But it's got nothing to do with the creator God of the Bible, who's created the entire universe, the heavens and the earth, the bits we do understand, the bits we don't. So that's the first thing. The second thing now is, well, let me tell you what Hawking says to replace God. Here it is, the key statement in his book, The Grand Design. And you say, are we going to go into A-level physics? No. Are we going to go into O-level physics? No. What are we going to go into? I'll tell you in a minute. We're going to do a little bit of logic. Here's the statement. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. And when I read that first, I thought, say that again? Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction number 1. Secondly, because there is a law of gravity, not because gravity exists. Now, this is a huge confusion, thinking that laws can create the universe. I once had a very interesting discussion with the famous atheist Peter Atkins, professor at Oxford. And I said, Peter, what created the universe? And he said, mathematics. And I was so taken aback that very rudely, and I confess it, that I started to laugh. He said, why are you laughing? Well, I said, I am a mathematician, and that's the silliest thing I've heard for a long time. He said, why is it silly? Well, I said, Peter, let me put it simply. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever, on its own, put £2 in your pocket? Incidentally, the financial crisis was caused in part by very clever people thinking that mathematics could create money. I would call that creative accounting. But actually, mathematics doesn't create money. And C.S. Lewis, who was brilliant at this, saw it long ago. He said you can add 1 + 1 + 1, you can add it to all eternity, but if you don't get £1 and £1, it'll never give you £2. Doing mathematics won't create anything. Another example. Newton's laws of motion have never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People with cues do that. The laws describe the motion. So Hawking is completely wrong in saying, because there is a law of gravity. What would a law of gravity mean if there's no gravity? Well, I'll pass that by and go to the final bit. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. Pardon? If I say X creates Y, roughly that means if you've got X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, That roughly means if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? It means that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. It is sheer nonsense. Now, I'll say nothing about nothing. The universe, this is the big idea these days, because physicists, some of them, have come to the conclusion that God's gone, and what are we left with? Nothing. So what you have to choose now is not God or mass energy, it's God or nothing. And I give lectures on nothing. I find them very interesting, but I'm not going to lecture you on nothing. If you want to ask me about nothing, I'll tell you about nothing afterwards, but not now. All right? Because I have nothing to say at this point on it. But when I read that as a central argument for dismissing God, I thought, what are we coming to? It's not science. It's not A-level science. It's not university science. It's not O-level. It's nonsense. Logical nonsense coming from one of the brightest people. And they do write amazing stuff, some of these people, in their mathematics. And he's a genius. But as for getting rid of God, it does no such thing. But I want to go a little bit further than that, because there's a huge confusion about science. And if you get it sorted out, it can help you go a long way in this field. And that is, what is a scientific explanation? I was taught the law of gravity. I love it because deriving the elliptical orbits of the planets around the sun from Newton's law is a gloriously artistic thing to do. But you see, when I first met the law of gravity, I thought it explained gravity. It was many years before I realized that nobody knows what gravity is. And the law of gravity does not explain gravity, as Newton himself realized all those years ago. You see, this comes to some people as a shock. Even within science, a law is usually non-comprehensive. It only gives you insight into something. Now, the law of gravity gives you brilliant insight into doing calculations of the relative motion of heavy bodies and enables you actually, without Einstein's corrections, to land a person on the moon. It's brilliant. Doesn't tell you what gravity is. Nobody knows what gravity is. And that's the trouble, because so often you hear, oh, well, we found a law, science says this, therefore God doesn't exist. That's usually sheer nonsense. Point number 2, again on explanation. How shall we explain this boiling water? Well, just imagine there's a Bunsen burner there and it's heating the water and the water's agitated and the molecules are moving faster and faster and the steam's rising. That's why it's boiling. Well, actually, it's boiling because I would like a cup of tea. Now, which of those two explanations is correct? They're both correct. Now, see here the danger of making science the only way to truth. There are scientists who tell you that only the scientific explanation is valid. I want to tell you that the agent explanation, my personal desire for a cup of tea, is actually, well, people have been enjoying tea for thousands of years before they knew anything about heat transfer and heat equations and all the rest of it. Do you see? The point I'm making is there are different levels of explanation. They don't compete. They don't conflict. They complement. Let me put it this way. God no more competes with science as an explanation of the universe than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the way a motor car engine works. You need both. Why cannot people see it? Well, they do. I find at school, third form level, they can understand it. It saddens me when university students and professors can't see it. It is so important to realize that not only are there different levels of explanation of the same thing that complement each other, often it's the non-scientific ones that are by far the most important, except in science. So once you see that God isn't competing with science at all, then you can begin to take a deep breath and do some more exploration. And every scientific discovery that's made, that's a genuine discovery, you can say, well, isn't this brilliant that God did it this way? Instead of it becoming a huge problem, it becomes a marvelous insight into the ways of God. So those are some ideas of this. But I want to finish just with one little, a kind of story. I'll tell it in the form of a story, otherwise it'll take too long. But what is the significance of the fact that we can do mathematics? You say, what do you mean? Well, it's one of my main reasons for not being an atheist. Not because I'm a Christian, but because I'm a scientist. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, let me tell you about several conversations I've had. They all go the same way. I say to a scientist, tell me, what do you do science with? Oh, we got this $100 million machine. No, I don't mean that. I mean, oh, you mean my, and they're about to say mind, when they realize that it's not politically correct to say mind, so they say brain. They think the mind and the brain are the same thing. I don't, but let us stand for a minute. Okay, you do science with your brain. Yes. Oh, tell me about the brain. What's the story of your brain? Boil it down to the absolute essence. And so often I get something like this. Well, my brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, I say. And you trust it? Well, what do you mean? Well, tell me honestly. I put this to many people. If you knew that your computer or your research instruments were the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you even use them? I've always had the answer, no. Now I said, you're in a problem, aren't you? Because you're using your mind, and yet your philosophy of mind is undermining the very rationality you need to do your science with. Now that is a very important argument. Again, Lewis was the first to point it to me. He said, we do science by thinking, and that's wonderful. But what we haven't done is think about thinking. And any theory that invalidates thinking cannot be true because you reach it by thinking. The fascinating thing is a leading atheist philosopher has caught onto this recently. His name is Thomas Nagel, and if you Google him, you'll see what a furore he's called in cyberspace by the atheists, because he's making the point, which is essentially this: if Dawkins and the other people are right in their explanation of the origins of the mind in mindless, unguided processes, then they're undermining not only the credibility of their explanation, but the credibility of any explanation of anything. That's why I'm not an atheist, ladies and gentlemen, because I have far too high a view of science to go for a theory that undermines it. Now, one of the fascinating things is this, that we have lived, at least I have lived, it happened before most of you were born, I'm ancient, to discover that not only is the universe mathematically describable in a very precise language, which is marvelous stuff, I hope you all love it, but there are strong linguistic elements coded into the very DNA of our cellular structure. And each of us have got many copies of the longest word that's ever been discovered. The DNA code, 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order. Now, isn't it interesting? And I test people. You look around and you see on a church door the word exit, E-X-I-T, 4 letters. You know immediately that that cannot be explained in purely natural processes. There's a mind behind it that understands the word exit. Well, if you say that with a 4-letter word, what are you going to say for 3.5 billion letters in the right order? You see, ladies and gentlemen, as I conclude, These two worldviews we're faced with go like this. Either in the beginning was nothing or mass energy, and everything else developed through unguided natural processes until we get brain, and then as an epiphenomenon mind, and then the idea of God, because there isn't a God. The other worldview goes like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him. And without him, nothing came to be that came to be. That I find is stunning, because it's telling you that the real understanding of nature is the exact opposite of what you're being sold. For the naturalist or materialist, word is derivative. Mass energy or nothing is primary. The biblical view is that word is primary and everything else is derivative. It couldn't be more different. And to me as a scientist, the biblical view makes much more sense. And then that opens up into a staggering claim that the Word became human and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory, glory as of the only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. And just perhaps you're sitting here tonight looking for ultimate meaning in life. Science can help us a little way. But you see, all that I have said so far is the human search for understanding of the universe. If the Word became human, that now goes also the other way around, because this is God looking for you. And he's still looking for you and looking for me. But that's a story for later. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very much for a very thought-provoking and stimulating start to our evening. Now it's your turn. You get to scribble down your questions. You get to pass them to the ends of your rows in the aisles, and we'll then gather them in, sort them into some sort of logical order, or perhaps it'll just be chance, and we'll throw them up in the air. And while you're sitting in your seats, drinks will be brought to you, so you'll have your glasses charged and so on. If you need to use the loos, do make use of those facilities. We'll take a 5-minute break before we reconvene. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you very much for the 4,000 questions. It's great to have so many questions. Obviously, by definition, we won't get to all of them. What we're going to try and do is answer as many as possible by grouping them into areas and to grill John with those questions. Before we grill him, I just want to draw your attention to the beige-coloured cards in your pews, which are kind of response cards. It gives you a chance to say what you thought of the evening, topics you think you'd like us to tackle in the future. Also, it gives you a chance to say you'd like to find out some more by reading a gospel account, by exploring Christianity further, and put down your name and address. We promise not to send you any delivery vouchers or anything like that, but what we will do is put you in touch with somebody locally, whether you're in Kensington or Chelsea or Fulham or wherever, and that'll be most helpful to you. John, we've got lots of questions. First question, I think, from your publisher. Which of your books is the simplest to understand?
The one I'm writing just now. Not the first one, but for a fairly comprehensive approach to the whole quest of atheism, and not simply science, but philosophy, morality, Christianity, gunning for God is probably the easiest one to follow.
And that's on the table at the back. You'll be delighted to know. John, we're going to try and get through as many of these as we can in the time. What if truth was not the most important criteria? How do we know that we should care about truth?
Try that on your bank manager. My truth is I've got £50,000 in the red. No, sorry, in the black. And he says, well, my truth is you owe the bank £500,000. Where are you going to get with that? I don't actually understand the question, because the in question assumes that the words are understandable and they represent a certain truth on the part of the person. You can't get away from truth, ladies and gentlemen. And to say what if it is not the most important criterion, for what? For what? It's not a complete statement. You have to ask what you're thinking about. Now, when it comes to big things in life, truth is all important. If you go for a cancer diagnosis, you're going to be very interested in truth. A friend of mine has said that people lose concern for truth only in areas that they think are not important, which sadly often include morality, but everywhere else you're concerned about truth.
John, is it possible, there's a number of questions about creation, an awful lot of questions actually. Let me give you a flavour of 2 or 3 of them. Is it possible to believe in both creation and evolution? Do you believe God orchestrated the Big Bang? If so, how do you comprehend this? The Bible seems to suggest humankind has been around for circa 6,000 years, and yet science suggests it's been around for a lot longer. How do we rationalise those?
Is that all?
There are more.
Well, this is a huge topic. Now, the fact is, there are many people who profess Christianity and are very credible Christians who accept evolution at various levels, some the complete neo-Darwinism. I'm a bad person to ask because I'm a mathematician, and we've got quite a track record of skepticism, not just on the part of Christians. But I just say 1 or 2 things. What I think about it, I've written in my book, Has Science Buried God? God's Undertaker. But what gets missed in all of this is there are 2 separate things. For many years, Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, was the authoritative, almost Bible on this. That the blind, unconscious mechanism of natural selection, which Darwin discovered, is the explanation of the existence and all the variations in life. He's retracted that because it's wrong. And it's seriously wrong. Because the one thing evolution, no matter what you believe about it, cannot account for is life. For a very simple reason, that evolution, whatever it does, requires life before it can start. And therefore the big issue actually is not what level variations can go to, and what Darwin observed, as far as I can see, we can observe, it's not controversial. Where it becomes a bit more controversial is this mechanism of natural selection which does something, can it bear the weight that's put on it? One thing it certainly cannot do, and Dawkins admits it, and most biologists do, it cannot account for life. The origin of life from a scientific perspective is a bigger mystery today than it was in 1953 when they thought they'd solved it. And the reason for that is that if you're going to explain the origin of life, you have to explain the origin of information. But now, the thing underlying this is often that if evolution does something, then God cannot exist. That is a false argument. The law of gravity does all kinds of things. But it's not an argument against God. Let me put it this way. The existence of a mechanism that does something is not an argument against the existence of someone who designed the mechanism, even if there are random elements in the mechanism. I have a watch that's self-winding. That is, it winds with the random movements of my arm. To argue that it hasn't been designed is ridiculous. It's actually cleverer than one that winds with a spring. But if you want to follow arguments like that, perhaps the simplest book, since we're into simple books, is I've written a book called 7 Days That Divide the World. And you can guess it is about the Genesis account of creation. And it is much more accessible than my first book, God's Undertaker. And I'll have to leave you, if you're really interested in what I think about these things, I leave you to have a look at that. And have a look at some of the lectures I've given. There's one in New York and Socrates in the City on that, 7 Days That Divide the World, but it's less than an hour, so you can get the flavor of it in a brief time. So shameless advertising has to deal with some of these questions because they are big questions and they're important questions.
John, a number of questions about evidence and science. What evidence is there in our world for the existence of a creator? You said a lot about how science doesn't disprove God. Is there any positive evidence that suggests God's existence from science? Can science prove the existence of God? If so, how?
Well, the word proof is the problem here. You see, I'm a mathematician, and you get rigorous proof in mathematics. You don't get it in any other intellectual discipline, not physics, not chemistry, not anywhere else, only in mathematics. And we use the word proof lazily. We alternate in popular language between the mathematical rigor and the legal, informal definition of proof. Evidence beyond reasonable doubt. Now, the important thing about that is this. One, you will never get mathematical proof of anything except in mathematics. So in that sense, you cannot prove or disprove the existence of God. But in the informal sense of the word proof, that's a different matter altogether. And it doesn't mean that the proof is less rigorous. It's only that it's different. For instance, I've been married to the same girl for 50 years. I can't prove to you mathematically that she loves me, but I'd give my life for her. I'm going to America tomorrow on a plane. I can't prove mathematically that it's going to get me there, but I've committed my life to it. So in other words, we can find in life positive evidence. We trust surgeons, we trust doctors, we trust trains and so on. Now, I thought I was giving you positive evidence for God tonight. I wasn't simply claiming you can't disprove God. I said, first of all, the history of science points strongly towards a connection between faith in God and science. That's positive. I pointed out, secondly, that when we begin to understand the nature of God and the fact that God is a mind, that makes perfect sense of the mathematical describability of the universe. That, to my mind, is very powerful evidence for the existence of God from science. Thirdly, the existence of DNA, as well as all kinds of very sophisticated mechanisms that require linguistic understanding, fits perfectly with the idea that a mind's behind them. So I think there are all kinds of positive evidences for God. It's another matter when you come to the God as revealed by Christianity, but we haven't had a question about that yet, so I'm saying nothing about it yet.
Let me just push you a little bit on that.
Push
Somebody
away.
said, our world is no more special than Mars or Jupiter.
Oh, really?
Can't it just be chance?
Well, no, wait a minute. The world is no more special than Mars or Jupiter. That's false. They are barren, uninhabitable planets compared with the lush, spectacular complexity of our world. So to say it's no more special, I just don't even begin to understand. And then to say, can't it just be chance? That isn't an argument. What do you mean, can't it just be chance? You're assuming that it's no more special. Well, if you assume that, well, how do you know it's by chance? You see, what do you mean by chance? Chance usually means that we can't quantify it because we don't understand enough about it. But when you see these aforementioned planets, including the Earth, moving in perfect orbits described by Newton's laws, and think back of the history of discovering that, and the sheer beauty of it, the artist in you, your sense of beauty would say, look, there's something going on here. Now, of course, if you refuse to see that, that's fine. But to say, couldn't it just be a chance? I don't begin to relate to that, I'm afraid.
Somebody's a related comment. What do you make of Dawkins' comment that Christian faith is blind faith, a leap in the dark in the absence of the evidence?
Well, sadly, some Christians think it is. I don't. I think Dawkins' atheism is the prime example of blind faith, actually. You see, here's the odd thing. Faith is a much misunderstood concept. And so often I meet people who say, well, you see, the trouble with you is you're a man of faith. We're scientists. We don't believe in faith, which is nonsense. Science depends centrally on faith. Einstein was clever enough to see that. He said, I cannot imagine a scientist without that faith. He didn't mean faith in God. He meant faith in the rational intelligibility of the universe. If you do not believe that science can be done, believe it as an article of faith, you'll never do any science. So it's nonsense to say that religion is faith, science has no faith. Now, blind faith, alas, Dawkins has popularized this. He thinks all faith in the God question is blind, which is absolute nonsense. You see, my faith in God is evidence-based, as is my faith in my wife, as is my faith in many scientific results. You scientists in the audience, did you do all the experiments and check them in your physics textbook at O level? Of course you didn't. You believed what was written. You're a person of faith because it's certain authority. Now, you see, it's quite obvious that Jesus himself understood faith to be evidence-based because John wrote a gospel, and here's his reason for writing it. He says, many other signs Jesus did, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. In other words, the New Testament is written as evidence upon which faith can be based. If Christianity was blind faith, there would be no New Testament. So there's a huge confusion here, and it leads to nonsense. Listen to Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher, whom I enjoyed meeting and debating, even though we went at it hammer and tongs, as you see on the internet. He writes and he says, our beliefs are not a belief, our faith is not a faith. Well, that's just sheer nonsense. And it's because he's mixing up blind faith with actual faith. Now, all of us know what evidence-based faith means. And if you don't, you've never been to a bank manager to get a loan. Because the first thing he'll say is, what collateral can you offer me? Why do you believe this is a sound scheme? Oh, well, I just think it is, you know. I mean, I have blind faith. The thing is going to be, you'll never get a penny that way. And in society, we would be foolish to trust people without evidence. Just look at the conning that goes on in our society on the internet. When gullible people, and sometimes people not so gullible, trust folks, we got to learn to trust on the basis of evidence. And therefore, my Christianity is not blind. It's the exact opposite. It's a commitment based on evidence.
Let me pick you up on that. A number of questions about miracles and how can you believe in miracles. Here's an illustrative one. How, as a scientist, can you believe in miracles that Christians claim Jesus did? Doesn't the resurrection of Christ break the laws of nature? Shouldn't a scientist therefore deny it?
No. Is that enough of an answer? No, it isn't. You see, here's confusion upon confusion. Don't miracles break the laws of nature? No, they do not. Suppose I'm staying in a hotel in London and I put £100 in the drawer tonight. I stay tomorrow night, I put another £100 in. That's 200, isn't it? I go to clear the drawer the next morning and I find 50 quid in it. Now you tell me, have the laws of arithmetic been broken or the laws of England? Which? Which have been broken? Tell me. The laws of England. How do you know that? Because the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. You see, it's a confusion of thought. What are laws? They're not like laws that say if you park in this area, you're going to face a fine. The big confusion lies with not understanding the difference between the scientific idea of a law and the legal idea of a law. Now let's just look at it very simply. You see, the laws of arithmetic and the laws of science are descriptions of what normally happens. Now, what can science tell you about resurrections? It can tell you they're very rare. Suppose I sent all of you out to Highgate Cemetery after this and gave you a notebook, a lamp, and a hot water bottle. And say, you sit there all night and record 1 if you see a resurrection and 0 if you don't see a resurrection. And you come tomorrow night and I collect all the books 0, 0, 0, 0. What does that prove? It proves that resurrections are improbable. But to say they're impossible, you would have to have observed every tomb in the entire history of humankind. And you see, here's the interesting thing. There is a record of a tomb 20 centuries ago that was observed, very carefully observed. Now, when Jesus came out of that tomb, he didn't break any laws of nature, because we're not claiming as Christians that he came out of the tomb by some natural process. What the New Testament says is God raised him from the dead. Now, if I can compare the sublime with the ridiculous, my hotel room with the money in the drawer, what did I think about that drawer? I thought it was a closed system of cause and effect. It turned out to be wrong, because a thief came and put his or her hand in and grabbed 150 quid. That didn't break any laws except the laws of England. But it's because the laws of arithmetic aren't broken that I know he broke the laws. Otherwise, I would have said, well, that's interesting. 100 plus 100 equaled 200 yesterday. Now they equal 50. Oh, well, there we are. It's confusion of thought to think that it's impossible for a scientist to believe in miracles. Now, there's a huge lot more to be said, because if you've been listening to what I said about the human mind, if the human mind is not to be explained within naturalistic assumptions, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid you don't even have to go to the miracles of the New Testament. The human mind is supernatural. If it's not natural, that's logical. The very fact that you can think is actually evidence of the supernatural. In fact, it's evidence that you're made in the image of God. Now, that's a topic that C.S. Lewis developed, but it's an immensely important thing. So, to sum up, I don't believe in all claims to miracle. We got to be skeptical. We got to check things out at a distance. But the central miracle that God became human, and the evidence of it that God raised Jesus from the dead, I'm convinced of those because I've spent my entire life examining them. Now, if you want to see how I examine that, have a look at the last 2 chapters of my book, Gunning for God, and I have a detailed explanation of how I go about forensically investigating the evidence.
John, I'm conscious time is flying. I've got a very quick question for you, which is a question of fact, hopefully, and then lots of questions about this one last final big question. Question of fact, has anyone made a study of how many scientists of note or distinction, say in the 20th century or the post-World War II period, have started out as atheists but come to believe in God as a result of their studies?
I expect they have, and I've read some stuff of that, and there's certainly quite a few. I was talking to a friend in America recently, and he was telling me a friend of mine who won the Nobel Prize for Physics became a Christian not long ago. And I mean, that's anecdotal, but it's true. The point is, people can change their worldview. And that actually was very important to me. You realize I'm Northern Irish. It's not very difficult to tell that, is it? And when I got to Cambridge, people said, of course you believe in God. All you Irish believe in God and you fight about it. And that's the Freudian explanation. And I had to spend a lot of time untangling it. Is that right? So it was very important for me to befriend people, and I've done it all my life, to befriend people who do not share my background or my worldview. And when I began to see them become Christians, having investigated with me or with others the evidence, I began to realize, no, it's not an accident of birth. You can become a Christian. You can change your worldview on the basis of coming to the conviction that Christianity is true.
Big last question, conscious it's not a small one. Lots of people have asked it. Thank you for your talk. I now understand God is more likely to have shaped our world than not. But why the God of the Bible? Why the Christian God? Why do you choose to believe in the Christian God when there are so many other gods out there? Professor Lennox, would you be prepared to tell us your definition of God? What is God for you?
Well, taking the last one first, we can't get very far with science. You can get the impression of a rational mind behind the universe and a powerful mind. But you see, Christianity does something much more. It's claiming that God became human. The Word became flesh. And so if I want to understand more about God, I realize two things. One, that I was made in his image as a person. And God has revealed himself historically in Jesus Christ, who was human as well as being God. And so my definition of God, and I'm not evading the question, is have a look at Jesus Christ. Read the Gospels. Soak your mind in them. And just begin to realize how simply wonderful he is and what he offers. Now that brings me to the second question. It's a perfectly legitimate question. You see, I was asked to address the question, is it possible to believe in God in a scientific world? My answer to that is yes. But I can answer that without even mentioning Christianity, which I mostly did tonight. But now you're asking me a different question, which I'm more than happy to address, and that is, why Christianity? Well, I have a number of reasons for that. Some of them are objective, and some of them are subjective. You see, coming to the objective, take the three great monotheistic faiths, and I have friends in all of them: Islam, Christianity, Judaism. My Jewish friends believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he died and rose. Those three views cannot be simultaneously correct, factually correct. And my Muslim and Jewish and Christian friends all admit that. So how do you decide? There are certain facts you can decide about. You can investigate the evidence. And one of the most interesting ways to do that at a popular level is to read Lee Strobel's book. What's it called? The Case for Christ? Where he's an atheist senior reporter who goes around talking to people who are Christians because he wanted to disprove the resurrection. But he became a Christian, and he tells you how. So on the factual side, I think there's a lot that you can do. But then there's another thing, you see. Let's not name any other religions. The first thing I say when I speak to people of other religions is, we must be very clear about this, that as you look at all the religions and philosophies in the world, you'll find in all of them common moral elements. Now that's immensely important. The golden rule, do unto others as you would be done by, is in every philosophy, religion, pagan, humanist, atheist that you can find. And it's very interesting to look them all up. C.S. Lewis did so in a little appendix to his book, The Abolition of Man. So when I start to ask questions about the content of religion, please, ladies and gentlemen, and I mean this very sincerely, I was taught in Ireland by my parents, where it was a divided country between Protestants and Catholics. And my father was bombed. Why? Because he employed both sides equally. And he taught me to respect everyone and to value them no matter what they believed. So that's my starting point. Every man and woman, all of you, whatever you believe, you're made in the image of God and therefore you're of infinite value. That's point number one. But now, where religions differ is on this matter of relationship with God. Because, and now I'm generalizing, generally speaking, a religion offers you a way or a path, and you try to follow that path, and you hope that in the end, when the great assessment comes, and there's usually an assessment of some kind of judgment, that your good deeds will outweigh your bad deeds, and you will be accepted into heaven, nirvana, whatever it happens to be. So that the basic principle is merit. In fact, it's like Imperial College London, university course. And I've taught many university courses, and I like the students. And I'd love to give them degrees, but I can't. It's their merit. And I can't tell them, you're going to get a first. I can help them and teach them. But they know that they won't know what degree they've got until the final assessment. Isn't that right? Now, many people think that that is religion. Indeed, many people think that's Christianity. You try your best, hope that God will be kind to you, and let you in. Well, that's religion. It's not Christianity, ladies and gentlemen. In fact, think about it. I met a girl many years ago, over 50 years now. 60 years, actually, nearly. Wow. And I thought she'd be good to marry her. So what I did was I came along and I said, Sally, I would like you to marry me. And I gave her a present, Mrs. Beaton's Cookery. You know the book? So I said, now, this book is full of laws. There's one set of laws in particular for making apple strudel, which I like. Thou shalt take so much flour, thou shalt take so many sultanas, thou shalt take so many apples, and thou shalt... Now I said, it's going to be like this. If you cook to my satisfaction for the next 40 years or so, and you help me to look after myself in the manner to which I've been accustomed, I'll think about accepting you. Otherwise, you can go back to your mother. What? Why are you laughing? That's the way millions of people think about God. It's exactly that. If I do this, if I do that, if I work, if I accept, then perhaps you'll accept me. You would never insult a fellow human being by treating them like that. Now I'm being strong, but you need to realize it, ladies and gentlemen. Do you know what I fear most? That people reject Christianity without ever having understood this. I remember speaking at the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and I explained that using that illustration. And I saw a scientist near the back, and his mouth just fell open. And he came up to me afterwards, and he said to me, are you telling me that Christianity is the exact opposite of what I thought it was? I thought it was me gaining the merit to be accepted, and you're telling me that you can't do that anyway. That Christ died for your sin. Now, this is unique to Christianity. Christ doesn't compete with anybody on this. And he said, look, I died for you. I gave my life for you. If you're prepared to trust me, I can bear the weight of all you've done wrong, and you can know you're accepted right now as you sit in this church tonight. He said, do you mean that? I said, I mean exactly that. Well, he said it was worth coming to Bulgaria just for me. Ladies and gentlemen, this is why Christianity is good news. It's speaking to us. I need forgiveness. I'm not perfect. I've made a mess of my life and other people's lives. No amount of piling up merit is going to cancel the past. I need something big enough so that I can stand and look at myself and not be afraid, because there's been a solution found to my guilt. Christianity is the only thing that offers me that. So let me make it clear. Christianity doesn't compete with any other religion, for the simple reason that Jesus Christ offers me something that none of them do. And therefore it's not arrogance to accept from him something that nobody else offers. And you see, it's not arrogant, therefore, for me to sit here and say, I actually know that God has accepted me. I'm not worried about the judgment. I know that one day I will go to spend a magnificent and fascinating eternity with God and with Christ, not because of who I am or the arguments I've mastered, but because Jesus loved me and died for me. That's the heart of it. And that really is why I'm a Christian and not anything else. Thank you very much for being so patient. Good night.
I want to thank all of you for coming this evening. I hope you found it informative, heartwarming, and mind-stretching. John won't be dashing off straight away. He'll be heading off fairly quickly. He's got a plane to catch to the United States tomorrow, so we want to make sure he gets his beauty sleep. But if you'd like to come and have a word, feel free to do that. Thank you for coming. Thank all the helpers for serving us so kindly this evening. And let's finish by thanking John again for giving up an evening to be with us.